BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the murder of Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper's final confirmed victim. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The first confirmed crime was on August 31st of 1888 with the murder of Polly Nichols. Then there was the murder of Annie Chapman on September 8th. There was a letter that was mailed on September 27th of 1888, although it was dated on September 25th. And this was the Dear Boss letter, which gave us the namesake, Jack the Ripper. Someone wrote this claiming to be the murderer of both Nichols and Chapman, and the Jack the Ripper name was introduced into, well, the history books at that point. After this, there was the double event on September 30th, where two women were murdered in one night, Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and following this, there were two communications that were mailed that a lot of people believe came from the killer. These would be the Saucy Jackie postcard and the From Hell letter, and ultimately there was the murder of Mary Kelly on November 9th of 1888, and even though I already said that she was Jack the Ripper's final confirmed victim, not everybody believes that because the Whitechapel murders went all the way until 1891 with the murder of Francis Coles. Many crimes happened in between November 9th and 1891. Recently on Ripper Wednesday, I decided to do some discussions on the individual canonical crimes that were committed allegedly and reportedly by Jack the Ripper. So I did episodes on the murder of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman. I did one on the double event, so it only seemed natural that I would do one on the murder of Mary Kelly, hence the episode today, The Murder of Mary Kelly, New Analysis. And I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to go through some of the Jack the Ripper books that I have read in the past, because even if I've read the book, I, of course, didn't memorize absolutely every single detail, so I wanted to try and obtain the information in a new way. And one book that I have been a big fan of in the past was The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, and I have a two-part book discussion about it here on Black Box Online Radio, and to give credit to him, these are some major points about the murder of Mary Kelly, which is perhaps the most famous unsolved murder in the entire world, and definitely one of the most horrific crimes that has ever been committed. We really have to go back to November 8th of 1888, the day before Mary Kelly was murdered, and she had a room that she rented at 13 Miller's Court in Whitechapel. And for a while she's renting this with her friend and also, we can call him boyfriend or lover, Joseph Barnett, and reportedly he was in the room on the evening of November 8th of 1888, although he did not stay the night because Joseph Barnett no longer lived with Mary Kelly. And there were a couple complications that existed in their relationship. One of them was, the most widely discussed one is that she was a prostitute and he did not like that. Joseph Barnett worked as a fishmonger, although he was also reported to have stints of unemployment. But one other reason that is talked about in some of the sources that I've just encountered prior to this episode is that a big reason why Joseph Barnett did not want to stay with Mary Kelly anymore is because she was also giving her room to her friends, and she was allowing her female friends to stay there for free, and he just felt that the room was too small and that there wasn't enough space for everybody, so there's some types of frustration that are existing. Although there is a report that there was a female friend who was there and spending time with Mary Kelly as well on November 8th of 1888. However, Joseph Barnett did not know her by name. And in the book The London of Jack the Ripper, Richard Jones proposes that the friend's name was actually Lizzie Albrook, and that this is important because she would have been a friend that was unknown to Joseph Barnett, whereas he would have known the regular guests or lodgers that would be spending time with Mary Kelly. But there are lots of different theories as to what Mary Kelly was particularly doing. One is that she was frequenting a pub called the Ten Bells, and that she went there to try and meet clients. And even Hallie Rubenhold, who wrote the book The Five, which is talking about how the majority of Jack the Ripper's victims might not have actually been prostitutes, even Hallie Rubenhold states that Mary Kelly was indeed a full-time prostitute, and she was trying to find clients. And also, according to the book The London of Jack the Ripper, it's most likely that Mary Kelly ate fish and chips the night before she was murdered, and those were found in her stomach contents, so she had earned enough money to pay for the food. And then Mary Kelly is seen walking with at least one man on the night, maybe two men, because we're going to see that there's some very odd descriptions of the individuals who have been passing by, going back to her room at 13 Miller's Court. Mary Kelly was the only victim of Jack the Ripper that was murdered indoors, and she was also mutilated the most extensively. Some people think that this was just as simple as Mary Kelly was killed because she had her own room. She had a place where the Ripper wouldn't be interrupted. She lived by herself. The friends weren't staying that night. And that a client went home with Mary Kelly, and he killed her. She was walking with Jack the Ripper, and completely unbeknownst to her, this man wanted to murder her. Other people think differently, and they think that Mary Kelly was a specific target, and that the Ripper mutilated her extensively because he wanted her more than the other victims. And we're going to see some different possibilities that exist as to how and why the Ripper could have been doing that. But also, with the story that is shared in the London of Jack the Ripper, there's also information that could be giving clues to when Mary Kelly was murdered. And I'm openly going to tell you, I cannot pinpoint the exact time that Mary Kelly was murdered, and because of her extensive mutilations, I'm not even convinced that the doctors would know exactly when Mary Kelly was murdered after investigating and examining her body. For example, there was a scream that was heard by a woman named Elizabeth Prater at 4 a.m. where she claimed that someone shouted the word murder. And sometimes it just says in other books that she heard someone scream murder, but in others it's listed as a quotation that that's a specific word that she heard around 4 a.m. But because people regularly shouted stuff like that in Whitechapel, she didn't think much of it and just wasn't even overly alarmed by that. And another one who may have heard the scream was Sarah Lewis. But that's at 4 a.m. And there's also a witness sighting where somebody came forward, and her name was Caroline Maxwell, and she claimed, though, that she saw Mary Kelly walking outside at 8 o'clock in the morning, 8 or 8:30 in the morning on November 9th of 1888. And that would mean that the murder would have occurred much, much later, but I can be very, very honest with you. I think that 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. would be a much more suitable time for the murder of Mary Kelly, and I just don't think that this sighting of her at 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the morning is credible at all. Maybe somebody was confused, maybe she just got mixed up, and maybe she just wasn't aware of what was really going on. And in short, no matter what, I don't think that that was actually Mary Kelly who was witnessed at 8 a.m. on November 9th of 1888. So there are other people who get incorporated in this story, because, as I said, there is a witness description of a man who was seen with Mary Kelly or seen walking in the area on the night of November 8th. One of them comes from the previously mentioned Sarah Lewis, who says, and I quote, "He was not tall but stout, had on a wide-awake black hat. I did not notice his clothes. Another young man with a woman passed along. The man standing in the street was looking up at the court as if he was waiting for someone to come out." And this is, of course, just a very, very simple description, but this is also the type of description that I would expect someone would generate. The more famous description of the perpetrator comes to us from a witness named George Hutchinson, who goes on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect himself. And his description of the killer was, well, I shouldn't say the killer, the man seen walking with Mary Kelly, and it was extremely detailed. He's making comments about the cuffs that he was wearing, saying he has an extremely thick gold chain. He had a horseshoe pin, an astrakhan. He said that he could identify the man, but also he waited 2 days to come forward, and the amount of detail that he provided just seemed extremely peculiar. He then goes on to state that he waited for 45 minutes to see if this man would reemerge from 13 Miller's Court, or come out walking in some way, and then he gave up waiting. Now, the Ripper may have spent about 2 hours murdering Mary Kelly and cutting up her body, but 45 minutes to wait in the cold, by himself, not doing, well, and much of anything, is also very peculiar. So this has created a certain amount of suspicion, and I'm going to come back to George Hutchinson later, but let's talk about the actual murder of Mary Kelly, and these details are also shared in another book that I've discussed with you guys recently, and that is Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies, who talks about how Mary Kelly was strangled and she had her throat cut, and then her breasts were removed. One breast was left by her feet and the other one by her head. Her liver was pulled out and placed in between her legs, and her uterus was pulled out and placed by her neck. Her intestines were pulled out, and blood and feces was actually splattered all over the room or smeared in different places, and then the intestines were placed in multiple places, one of which was on a bedside table, or I guess you would call it an end table, and most famously, Mary Kelly's heart was taken out and removed and taken by the killer. Then there is also the mutilations. There are the mutilations that were done to her face, cutting her up beyond recognition, except leaving her eyes and hairline intact. So this is absolutely gruesome and sickening, and this is one of the reasons why so many people are fascinated by the Jack the Ripper case, because they just can't comprehend why one human would want to do this to another human. Okay, those are all the basic rundowns about the stuff that's leading up to the murder of Mary Kelly, the events that are leading up to the murder of Mary Kelly and the crime as it was committed by itself. Now, another book that I've been talking to you guys about recently has been I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter, and it is a novel, but he attempts to make a first-person narrative as to what Jack the Ripper was thinking when he committed the crime. And oddly, he does not have the Ripper as a client of Mary Kelly who's seen walking with her. He does not place the Ripper in that position at all, the person that would have been seen by George Hutchinson. He really says some things quite to the contrary. He brings up a very important detail that is mentioned in the London of Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story, and countless other Jack the Ripper books. And that is that Mary Kelly is renting the room at 13 Miller's Court, and there was a broken window pane in the room. The window to her room had a broken window pane that was filled with rags and newspaper, and she also used a coat to serve as a curtain hanging over it. And the Ripper is somebody who is mostly targeting victims at random prior to the murder of Mary Kelly in the novel I, Ripper, and the way Stephen Hunter portrays him is, with the first crimes, he's just approaching women in vulnerable places, but the Ripper's making he's making a very direct plan to try and horrify people. He's making a very, very solid plan to make each crime more and more horrific. And with the murder of Mary Kelly, she's specifically targeted. He looks at her at a pub and develops this type of infatuation with her. He finds her to be physically attractive, and he decides that he is going to murder her, and he wants to make this one that is going to just shock the world. He, by his own admission, states that he wants women to be afraid and to be talking about the crime for days, so he just starts asking questions at pubs, talking to people who seem to know Mary Kelly, trying to get information about her, and then he starts following her. And when he finds out that she lives at 13 Miller's Court, he begins to investigate the area. He sees that there's this broken window pane. He examines it, and even does almost a dry run, or almost just a test run to see if he can break in, move the latch on the window, open it, and enter the building. And on the night of Mary Kelly's murder, which is a different night after his trial run, he breaks in at about 5 a.m., and this is really interesting, so it's not the 4 a.m. murder call, but it would be around 5 a.m., which might actually be the real time that Mary Kelly was murdered. And then the Ripper just sees Mary Kelly sleeping in bed by herself, and he cuts her throat. He strangles her and he cuts her throat. One very odd thing that is shared in Stephen Hunter's I, Ripper is that he states that Jack the Ripper cuts Mary Kelly's throat, and then she's still able to fight him, and he states that she is very strong as she is fighting, so he cuts her throat a second time, almost in the same groove, but he cuts her throat again, and she's actually able to fight the Ripper for an entire minute. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but I don't even know if that's possible. It's my understanding that if someone were to have their throat cut and was going to go through the jugular vein and the carotid artery, that they would be going into shock, let alone they would be bleeding out? Would they really be able to fight and fight strongly for 1 whole minute? And this is also important to remember. He states that the Ripper cuts her throat twice. So these are some odd details that I think are shared in the novel I, Ripper. But then the Ripper begins his mutilations, again, all for specific, calculated, and terrorizing reasons. And there's even this line in I, Ripper where Jack the Ripper takes Mary Kelly's heart, places it into the pocket of a frock coat, and he states that he'll get away with this because no one will be able to see the bloody heart underneath a giant overcoat, the larger overcoat that the Ripper would have been wearing. Again, it's November in England. That would be completely normal attire. But finally, in the novel I, Ripper, there's a discussion about how, okay, the Ripper isn't only doing this to terrify people. He's not just trying to make people feel bad for the sake of feeling bad. He's not just trying to murder women for the sake of murdering women. He's doing this because he had some type of particular heartbreak in the past, and he's trying to create some sort of revenge plot and some sort of revenge angle. So what do you think about any of these particular details? Do you think that Mary Kelly allowed her client to enter the room? Or do you think that Mary Kelly was sleeping in bed and Jack the Ripper entered her bedroom through a window? Which one sounds more plausible to you? Now, I had always been under the impression that Mary Kelly allowed Jack the Ripper into the bedroom, and I was discussing this on a live stream recently. I go live every Tuesday and Thursday for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. It is a live stream that I do here on Black Box Online Radio, and if you want to check those out, I invite you to listen to them. You can ask anything you want on True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And giving a shout out to 158, who asked some interesting questions on the most recent one, when he was talking about some comments that I had made recently about how I was even beginning to postulate that Jack the Ripper may not have even conversed with the women before attacking them. With the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, that Jack the Ripper might have been just hiding in the shadows and attacking the women. And the reason why was I was stating that it just didn't seem like it was purely necessary, or that there was even evidence that Jack the Ripper had conversations with the women prior to being murdered. And I think that I was influenced by the novel I, Ripper in somewhat of a bad way, where he's telling these very detailed stories. By he, I mean the author, Stephen Hunter, which it's a novel, he can take creative liberties, but he's telling these detailed stories about how Jack the Ripper is asking the women for sex, he's having sex with the women first. I'm like, whoa, I don't know if we have evidence of that. It's possible. Some people think that the Ripper left a semen stain on Catherine Eddowes' shawl. My stance on that is that it's all unconfirmed evidence, or it's unconfirmed DNA. But I just thought that that was so elaborate. I'm like, wait a second. How do we even know that Jack the Ripper is having the conversations with the victims? So that's why I went back to some of this type of thinking that I had in the past about maybe Jack the Ripper didn't talk to the victims at all, and he's just waiting for a woman to walk by with no one around, and he attacks her. But 158 points out, most likely, Jack the Ripper did walk with Mary Kelly and entered her room. How would that fit into the narrative? And the short answer is, it doesn't. I would have to admit that perhaps I was wrong about that particular detail. Yes, of course, Stephen Hunter has laid out his case that Jack the Ripper entered the Miller's Court bedroom through the window while Mary Kelly was sleeping. All right, if that's your theory, but I also state there's perhaps insufficient evidence of that. The real thing is that I was influenced by Pat Brown, the psychological profiler and criminal profiler, and maybe I was influenced in somewhat of a bad way, because her whole theory is that Jack the Ripper was someone who did not converse with the victims. He didn't talk to the victims before murdering them. But she states that there were only 4 victims of Jack the Ripper: Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes. And she believes that Mary Kelly was not a victim of Jack the Ripper. So she just doesn't think that the person who was walking with Mary Kelly that night or conversing with Mary Kelly was the Ripper at all. She thinks it was a copycat who murdered Mary Kelly and tried to make it look like Jack the Ripper, and he overdid it. And somebody responded to me the first time I talked about that by saying that it's absolutely preposterous to think that just because Mary Kelly is murdered indoors and the other victims are murdered outdoors, that there are two different killers. And yes, I would agree with that, but that's not the exact claim that has been made by Pat Brown in regards to the murder of Mary Kelly. Instead, she is talking about how she believes that Mary Kelly was a victim of somebody who was a Ripper copycat, and she doesn't think it was Jack the Ripper because she thinks this person excessively mutilated her beyond what Jack the Ripper would have done. It's not the indoors-outdoors issue, it's the overkill, the excessive mutilations. They were trying to be Jack the Ripper, but they just were not able to stop or control themselves. As of now, I have a very conventional understanding of the Ripper case. I think there was one killer. I'm not convinced of any crimes outside of the Autumn of Terror from Nichols to Mary Kelly. I think there was one person who murdered those 5 women. Absolutely everything else is unconfirmed. 80% chance that Martha Tabram was actually murdered by Jack the Ripper, so that would be 6 victims. But even the other cases, Emma Smith, Rose Milett, Alice Mackenzie, Francis Coles, I think all of those crimes are just purely unconfirmed, and any type of Ripper connection to them is also unconfirmed. So, I mean, this is really great when you guys share things with me and I'm forced to admit that either I'm wrong about something or that perhaps I've made certain mental connections in the past that I wasn't completely aware of. But yes, if Jack the Ripper's murdering the women without talking to them and he's walking and talking with Mary Kelly, that wouldn't fit into any type of theory. So please, drop your comments in the section down below. Share something about Jack the Ripper. What do you think? What do you think about the ideas that have been discussed in this episode? And do you think that there's anything that is particularly telling about Jack the Ripper's behavior? Now, I told you I would come back to the suspect, George Hutchinson, and when I first looked at him, I thought he was a mediocre Jack the Ripper suspect, but as time went by, I really began to think more and more highly of him. And I'm just going to give you guys the absolute truth right now. The suspects that I've entertained the most in the past were the previously mentioned Joseph Barnett, Francis Thompson, Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Jacob Levy, and George Hutchinson. And with Hutchinson, though, there's something that's very odd that's shared in the book I, Ripper, and I had to read this paragraph 3 times to make sure that I understood it, because there's this alternative theory out there that George Hutchinson knew who Mary Kelly was. He saw her walking with a man, but he was confused. He got his dates mixed up. He was thinking about a completely different night. And the man who was walking with Mary Kelly was not on November 8th or 9th of 1888. It was a different day. You might be thinking, well, Mary Kelly was a very high-profile murder victim. How would he possibly get that date mixed up? Oh, I do all the time. Like, say, for example, I talked to you guys about something on Black Box Online Radio on Monday, and I was like, yeah, in last week's episode, I would say, oh, no. That was not last week's episode. That was this week's episode. Very easily you can confuse 2 days ago, 1 day ago with last week. So that is just something that, it's not even my own original observation. That is something that's been shared about George Hutchinson. Other people believe that he was making up those details because he just wanted to be a wild storyteller, attention seeker, someone who just got caught up in the moment. Other people are saying that he made up all those details because he was just trying to avoid suspicion. And I think that that's the idea that's expressed in The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, is that maybe he made up a story because he's trying to just put the blame off of him. So, okay, he knew Mary Kelly and he said he was walking with her. Well, I gotta give them something so they don't suspect me. That could be it. Or, ultimately, he was Jack the Ripper. But I told you guys on some previous episodes of Ripper Wednesday that I've been trying to make the show more dynamic, and I've been trying to include different elements and different subjects within all of my episodes on Black Box Online Radio, and I talked to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper, but of course on True Crime Talk Radio you can discuss any subject, and I found the show The Ripper Cast, and they were discussing not only the murder of Mary Kelly, but all things Jack the Ripper, and they really recommended a book called Will the Real Mary Kelly by Christopher Scott, and I'm going to put that on my radar for 2 reasons, because just last week, a longtime follower of this show, Batman66, recommended the book Will the Real Mary Mary Kelly, and I was like, okay, I mean, I have a couple recommendations for this book. I'm definitely going to look at it in the future. And Mary Kelly is a very famous victim, definitely the most famous victim of Jack the Ripper. And there are so many books that have been written about her, I can't even list them all off the top of my head, and I'm finding new ones all the time, and these will just be worked into future episodes of Ripper Wednesday. And you may have noticed that I've been releasing a lot of Jack the Ripper shorts recently, and one of the reasons is I have been going through some of my older Jack the Ripper books and Jack the Ripper episodes, and I've been turning them into short episodes, and I'm going to be doing a much larger project with those later on in the year. So one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these Jack the Ripper discussions, as well as the true crime ones about other subjects here on BBO War. Only if you want to, of course. And you can always write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. Now, as I said, I found an episode of the Ripper Cast. And about 3 weeks ago, somebody uploaded the backlog of this podcast, which was originally recorded in 2008, but they just uploaded it to YouTube. And I was discussing it last week as well. I'm going to be going through their episodes because it's always interesting to hear a multi-person discussion on a subject like Jack the Ripper. And firstly, they had a guest on the program in the episode that I just listened to named Robert McLaughlin, who was the author of the book, The First Jack the Ripper Victims' Photographs. And yes, it's a little bit of a mouthful to say. And I was really thrown into the deep end with this discussion because it's mostly about the history of photography, and I was like, wow, this is some uncharted territory for me. But once they tied it all into Jack the Ripper, it was just absolutely fascinating. Firstly, they're talking about how there are additional photos of the Jack the Ripper crime scenes and the victims and the mortuary photos that are not regularly available on the internet, particularly how there are multiple photos of Mary Kelly in the crime scene, that where Mary Kelly was found at 13 Miller's Court, and they were rediscovered in 1988 for the centennial anniversary of Jack the Ripper, and then they were sent to the Black Museum, and, well, first to Scotland Yard, then to the Black Museum, and then to the National Archives. But with this set of photos of the victims, there were photos of Liz Stride, the third victim, that were rediscovered in 1988, but then were lost again. So that just goes to show that there are so many different problems in the world of Ripperology and trying to actually get answers. But they also talked about some things that have been mentioned in, well, all of the books that I've mentioned in this episode, and that is how there is an inspector and member of law enforcement that did know Mary Kelly, and his name was Walter Dew. And Walter Dew is, of course, someone who is perhaps famous for the Dr. Crippen case, but he is also someone who thought very highly of connections with the pre-canonical Ripper victims, particularly Emma Smith, but also Martha Tabram, thinking that the same person was responsible for the killings. And he stated that he knew Mary Kelly personally, and I guess this just goes to show that London was a very small world at the time. But some other points that they shared on the program is that after the murder of Mary Kelly, there is an attempt that was made by the landlord, John McCarthy, as well as his assistant, who also went by the nickname Indian Harry. I said also, even though I didn't give his legal name, Bowyer, but he went by the nickname Indian Harry. And Mary Kelly was back on her rent. She was behind on her rent. And in one source, it states that she was 35 shillings behind on her rent. But in John J. Edelston's and in Jack the Ripper Encyclopedia, he wants to state very clearly that it was 29 shillings that she was behind on her rent, and that's what everybody should remember. So she owed money to McCarthy. So he went along with his assistant to try and either reclaim the money or find out what was going on with the situation. And they were not able to get any response at the door. And they were able to look through the window enough to see that there was an extremely horrific crime scene that had taken place where Mary Kelly was extensively mutilated. Then, when they alert the authorities, this is all happening at about 10:30 a.m., and the authorities are actually on scene at 10:45 a.m. But another point that John J. Edelston brings up in Jack the Ripper and Encyclopedia is that they wanted to bring bloodhounds first before they entered the room, and they actually waited for hours for the bloodhounds and just to get everything organized before they acted on anything. However, the doctor, George Baxter Phillips, did arrive at 11:30 a.m. He's also able to look through the window, and he made the statement that this woman is not in any condition where she requires medical attention. I'm like, wow, that's heartless. I mean, I suppose it's true, but it's heartless. So then they were actually able to get into Mary Kelly's bedroom at 1:30 in the afternoon. So many hours have gone by before they're even able to get access to Mary Kelly. And also, there is another statement that has been shared by Robert Graysmith, actually, who's the author of the book The Bell Tower, and his Jack the Ripper suspects are John Gibson and Jesse Gibson. He thinks that there were two people involved with the killings, and he stated that they actually had to take down the window to get the photographer in there to photograph Mary Kelly, and that appears to also just be a myth, or that's Robert Graysmith fudging the facts. And there is a discussion about this in the Rippercast episode 2, when they're talking about the photographer that was used, and according to Donald Rumbelow, the police, the city police, were the ones who were responsible for photographing the crime scene of Mary Kelly, but throughout his research, Robert McLaughlin actually learned that it was not the city police, it was a private citizen who was called in to photograph Mary Kelly's body. And also, in addition to some of these photographs that are not widely shared online, there are also photographs of the Jack the Ripper suspect Montague John Druitt, who drowned in the Thames, and he is thought to have been a very high-ranking Jack the Ripper suspect in the minds of many, although I don't personally think that he was Jack the Ripper, and he's very, very low on my list of suspects. But this just goes to show that there's an enormous amount of information that can be uncovered. It's just rather difficult to find and rather difficult to locate. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about anything that has been discussed in this episode? When do you think Mary Kelly was murdered? I mean, I'm not necessarily certain that this cry for murder at 4 a.m. was Mary Kelly. And to the credit of Richard Jones, he does state in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, it could be 3:30, could be 4 a.m., but I mean, I don't necessarily think that was referring to the murder of Mary Kelly. That's just a scream. We don't have enough information about it. And believe it or not, out of all the explanations that I heard, I started to think that Stephen Hunter's time frame was perhaps the best. Maybe Mary Kelly was murdered around 5 a.m. In the past, I had always expected that she would have been murdered much earlier than that. But, I mean, I just don't necessarily think that there would be enough evidence to say that she was murdered earlier in the day than that. I do not think that she was murdered at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. or anything after that, even though you could comprehend some type of time frame about how her body's not discovered until 10:30 or 10:45. Then maybe she was murdered at 9 a.m. Yes, okay. That's probably making an extraordinary amount of leaps. I think that perhaps Caroline Maxwell was just simply mistaken and did not see her. So, early AM hours of November 9th of 1888, and most likely I would expect that Mary Kelly was walking with a client, and this stealthy Ripper did not enter the window and just murder Mary Kelly in her sleep and slitting her throat twice, but she's still able to fight back. I don't really think that's what happened either. But what do you guys think? And is there one that particularly stands out to you? Do you think that there is a Jack the Ripper suspect that would have been suitable to murder Mary Kelly? Who do you think would be the most suitable to murder Mary Kelly? And one thing that really dropped Joseph Barnett on my list is something that I've shared before on Ripper Wednesday, so I'll be very brief. He's the one who identifies Mary Kelly, and he's the one who identifies her body by her hair and her eyes. So, I mean, I think that he would have had to have put on one convincing acting job to fool everyone, to make them think that he was not actually the killer. And I don't know if this unemployed fishmonger was actually capable of doing that. Now, I would love to know what you think about the Jack the Ripper suspects. What do you think about the timeline? What do you think about the activities of the Ripper? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. Please look out for future Ripper discussions here on Black Box Online Radio. Until next time.